Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of history's quietest mysteries. Not a roaring empire collapsing in flames, not a king dramatically yelling at the sky while enemies crash through the gates. Nothing that cinematic, unfortunately. Instead, we're talking about the Harappan civilization. A civilization so advanced, so organized and so strangely modern. They were city planning before much of the world figured out reliable plumbing. And then they were gone. Or at least mostly gone. No final battle. No giant tomb full of clues. Just abandoned streets, empty houses, and silent drains. Thousands of tiny seals covered in symbols we still cannot fully read. Historians have spent over a century begging these people to explain themselves. The Harappans have responded by remaining extremely dead and deeply mysterious. So tonight, let's drift back 5,000 years to the Indus River. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let us wander into one of the strangest civilizations humanity ever built. Long before Rome argued about aqueducts, there was Harappa. There were perfectly straight streets, brick cities, and massive granaries. People were calmly organizing urban life while much of the ancient world was still stepping in mud and hoping for the best. And yet, this enormous civilization faded away so quietly that history almost forgot it existed. The story begins around 3300 BCE. At this point, humanity was scattered. Egypt was gathering along the Nile. Mesopotamia was growing between the Tigris and Euphrates. In what is now Pakistan and northwest India, something unusual was taking shape. Small farming communities expanded into roads and trade networks. At its peak, the Indus Valley civilization covered nearly 1 million square kilometers, bigger than Egypt, possibly home to several million people. The Harappans did not seem obsessed with building gigantic monuments to individual rulers, no massive statues or giant pyramids. Instead, they invested in functional cities. Take Mohenjo-Daro. Streets crossed at neat right angles. Houses were built with standardized bricks. There were wells everywhere, public baths, covered drainage systems, wastewater channels. This was around 2500 BCE. Harappan society was deeply organized. Their weights and measures were consistent. Trade stretched from Central Asia to Mesopotamia. Picture merchants slowly guiding carts loaded with beads, cotton textiles, and pottery across dusty trade routes under brutal Bronze Age suns. Everything suggests a civilization that functioned through coordination rather than constant displays of violence. They appear quieter, more orderly. And then there is the writing. Thousands of inscriptions survive. Tiny symbols carved onto seals, pottery, and tablets, and nobody can fully decipher them. This script remains unreadable. For generations, researchers have stared at these symbols hoping for a breakthrough. No Indus version of the Rosetta Stone has appeared to save everyone from academic despair. The civilization speaks to us only in fragments. Old theories imagined invading armies destroying cities, but archaeology has complicated that story. There is little evidence for a giant invasion. Instead, the decline appears slower, messier, almost painfully ordinary. Civilizations like to imagine they collapse heroically, but often they simply wear down. Around 1900 BCE, signs of strain appear. Major cities lost population, trade declined, urban planning weakened. Some neighborhoods were abandoned. Climate change is one of the biggest suspects. Monsoon patterns shifted. Rivers changed course. Farming grew harder. Crops fail. Trade caravans arrive less frequently. People move away looking for stability. Slowly, urban life unravels. Picture a merchant walking home through Mohenjo-Daro around 1900 BCE. The streets are still there, but something feels thinner now. Humans almost never realize they are living through the end of an age. History quietly closes the curtains around them. The great cities emptied. and for thousands of years they slept beneath the earth. Villagers reused ancient bricks without realizing their age. Then, in the 19th century, the modern world stumbled back onto the ruins, a story of discovery and mystery that continues today. By the mid-1800s, the ancient cities of the Indus Valley had been buried for thousands of years beneath layers of dust, sand, and broken brick. One of the largest civilizations on Earth managed to disappear so thoroughly that even people living nearby often had no idea what rested underneath. Imagine future archaeologists discovering New York City after 5,000 years because somebody noticed unusually square piles of concrete under New Jersey. The rediscovery began slowly, involving the 19th century British Empire and their habit of wandering into ancient landscapes and immediately deciding to start digging. In the 1850s, railway engineers working in what is now Pakistan needed bricks for construction. Conveniently, there were enormous mounds nearby full of them. Thousands of 4,000-year-old Harappan bricks were hauled away and crushed beneath railway tracks. One of humanity's oldest urban civilizations was repurposed into infrastructure. To the workers, they were just very good bricks. Standardized, durable, and evenly baked. The Harappans might feel vindicated their materials lasted 4 millennia. Eventually, archaeologists realized these mounds belonged to something vast and ancient. In the 1920s, excavations at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro began revealing entire cities. Straight streets emerged from the soil. Houses, wells, courtyards, granaries, and drains. Seriously, the drainage systems became almost legendary among archaeologists. The Indus Valley civilization immediately proved itself equal in sophistication to Egypt and Mesopotamia, shocking historians who didn't realize South Asia's urban antiquity. Take Mohenjo-daro's Great Bath. Waterproofed with bitumen and carefully designed, nobody knows exactly how it was used, perhaps for ritual bathing or elite ceremonies. Unlike Egyptian pyramids, the Great Bath feels oddly practical. No giant statues or declarations about divine kingship. Just water, clean geometry, and quiet order. Their art feels restrained too. Small figurines, elegant seals, and delicate jewelry. The Harappans simply do not seem interested in bragging. Archaeologists found toys too. Little carts and figurines with movable heads. A child once rolled those across a courtyard 5,000 years ago. History becomes quieter when you think about ordinary people instead of kings. The Harappans forced this because they left so little evidence of rulers. No obvious royal palace dominates the city. Who governed? Was it a king, a priesthood, or merchant councils? Because we cannot read their script, it remains a mystery. Still, their achievements were undeniable. Streets aligned along grids and drainage systems connected homes to larger sewers. Some homes even had private bathrooms. Urban sanitation is incredibly difficult, yet the Harappans managed it astonishingly early across a huge civilization, suggesting coordination and long-term planning. They feel familiar because their cities suggest a society focused on systems rather than spectacle. A planner might have squinted at a drainage map just like today. Trade connected them to the wider world. Mesopotamian records mention Meluha, where merchants crossed seas and deserts exchanging goods across enormous distances. They exported beads, timber, metals, and textiles. Some beads are so finely drilled that archaeologists still debate exactly how they were manufactured. But life was not a utopia. Disease, floods, and infant mortality were high. Mohenjo-daro itself flooded repeatedly, and people simply rebuilt over older layers. Nature usually wins eventually. Climate studies suggest the monsoon system weakened and rivers shifted unpredictably, causing persistent environmental stress. Stability slowly leaks away. Urban systems are fragile. Once enough of those systems weaken, cities begin to unravel, not with fireworks, but with inconvenience. Large urban centers shrank as populations shifted eastward towards smaller rural settlements. The great Harappan machine slowly fragmented into regional cultures. Over centuries, the giant cities emptied. Writing disappeared. That last detail is haunting. An entire written system fell silent, forgotten for thousands of years. Only the bricks remained, waiting for trains and archaeologists to stumble back onto them. The more we discover, the more mysterious they become. How does one of humanity's greatest civilizations disappear so completely that for thousands of years the world forgets it ever existed at all? If you spend enough time studying ancient civilizations, you eventually notice a pattern. Human beings love rivers, absolutely adore them. We build cities beside them, worship them, depend on them, write poetry about them, fight wars over them, dump things into them that we probably should not. And then, every so often, the river quietly changes course and destroys everybody's plans. The Harappans understood rivers intimately because their entire civilization depended on them. The Indus River system was not just water. It was transportation, agriculture, trade, survival, and daily routine, wrapped into one muddy, unpredictable force of nature. Without rivers, there was no Harappan civilization. With unstable rivers, there might also be no Harappan civilization, which is the deeply frustrating balance. Modern humans like to imagine we are independent, but ancient civilizations were basically one difficult monsoon season away from collective anxiety attacks. And slowly, over centuries, the environmental balance supporting the Indus world may have begun slipping apart. Before we continue, it is important to understand something slightly annoying about archaeology. The farther back in time you go, the fuzzier everything becomes. Historians are not detectives uncovering perfect evidence. Usually they are tired people staring at dirt patterns while saying, "This might indicate seasonal flooding." So when we talk about Harappan collapse, we are talking about probabilities, clues, gradual patterns, not a final answer wrapped neatly with a bow. Still, environmental change appears everywhere. Some believe weakening monsoons reduced rainfall. Others point toward tectonic shifts affecting river systems. Some rivers may have dried gradually. Others changed channels dramatically. Imagine building an entire civilization around predictable water, only for nature to change. Not overnight. That would almost be easier. No, this happened slowly enough to confuse everyone. One generation notices smaller floods. The next notices declining harvests. Another notices caravans arriving less frequently because trade routes have shifted. And by then, urban systems are already straining. The Gagga-Hakra river system plays a major role. Today, much of it is dry, but thousands of years ago, larger rivers may have flowed through this region, supporting dense settlements. Many sites cluster around these diminished waterways. What if entire cities slowly lost access to reliable water? Not through dramatic catastrophe, through gradual disappointment. Ancient life already required exhausting amounts of labor, fetching water, growing food, maintaining walls, surviving heat. Once conditions worsen, the burden multiplies. Cities are especially vulnerable because they consume enormous resources. Food must arrive. Water systems must function. Trade networks need stability. Mohenjo-Daro may have housed tens of thousands of people. Keeping that many humans alive without modern technology is a daily miracle of logistics. And logistics become difficult when rivers start behaving unpredictably. Flooding repeatedly damaged the city. Again and again, water swept through. Again and again, the people rebuilt. You have to admire their persistence. Imagine spending your life repairing flood damage every few years. Someone was definitely staring at muddy streets thinking, perhaps we should live somewhere less aggressively wet. But moving entire populations is not simple. Families stay because parents are buried nearby, because routines feel familiar, because leaving means uncertainty. Humans cling to places. Decline likely unfolded unevenly. Some settlements survived longer, some adapted, some shrank quietly, others disappeared altogether. People often imagine collapse incorrectly, like a candle blinking out. But history usually behaves more like melting ice. Structures soften, systems weaken, and eventually something different emerges. The Harappans did not vanish. They changed. Their descendants continued farming, trading, and raising children afterward. Only the urban network disappeared. The standardized civilization fractured, and strangely, one of the clearest signs of this appears in something small. Bricks. The Harappans loved standardized bricks. Builders used remarkably consistent proportions across vast distances, suggesting strong cultural coordination. But during the decline, those standard sizes changed. Standardized infrastructure reflects social order. Once it vanishes, the systems enforcing consistency are weakening too. The Harappan brick system falling apart tells us their organization was unraveling. And then there is trade, another fragile thing we depend on. At the height, goods traveled enormous distances. Ships crossed the Arabian Sea. Caravans moved through mountains. Craftsmen relied on imported materials. But as instability increased, these networks weakened. Mesopotamian references to trade with Meluha gradually faded. Urban economies suffer quickly. Civilization is basically a giant web of people depending on strangers. When the web weakens, everybody feels it eventually. One eerie aspect is how little evidence exists for violent panic. Archaeologists do not find masses of weapons. There are few signs of warfare. Perhaps they simply drifted away because conditions no longer supported urban life. A slow migration outward, generation by generation. And eventually, memory changes. Human memory is fragile. Think how quickly families forget details across only 3 or 4 generations. Languages shifting, traditions blending, rivers moving. Eventually, entire cities become legends, then ruins, then anonymous hills. The Harappans faded so thoroughly that later civilizations built new histories without remembering them. That silence still unsettles archaeologists today. Egyptians left inscriptions everywhere. Mesopotamian kings documented campaigns. The Harappans left tiny, undeciphered symbols and excellent drainage. One famous artifact is the priest-king statue, a small carved figure of a bearded man with patterned clothing and a calm expression. Naturally, archaeologists named him Priest-King, despite having no proof. For all we know, he could have been a merchant or administrator. The figure embodies the strange calmness of Harappan culture. No oversized crown, no weapons, just a composed man staring across 4,000 years. Maybe that calmness is why it feels so haunting. The Harappans did not collapse loudly. They faded into the background. The Vedic cultures that emerged later developed different traditions and rituals. Over time, the urban Harappan world was buried. Perhaps memories survived in altered forms. Stories change. Rivers become sacred symbols. History and legend slowly braid together. Historians wander through fragments trying to reconstruct vanished worlds from pottery shards and flood deposits. A deeply humbling job. We do not know what their voices sounded like. We do not know their songs. We do not know the stories parents told children. We only see traces. A footprint in mud brick. A bead dropped in a workshop. A child's toy buried beneath dust. A city drain still running after 4,000 years. Those fragments feel more intimate than giant monuments. They remind us that civilizations are millions of ordinary lives layered together, lives that continue until the systems holding them together loosen. And eventually the river changes course, the streets empty, the writing stops, and the world moves on. One of the strangest things about the Harappan civilization is how little we truly know about the people. Not the cities, not the bricks, not the drains. The actual humans. The individuals who woke before sunrise and swept dust from their courtyards. They traded beads in crowded markets, repaired walls after floods, and slowly watched their world change. Yet, the Harappans remain oddly faceless. This is partly because they refused to leave behind giant ego monuments. Ancient rulers usually cannot resist immortalizing themselves in stone or gold. A pharaoh commissions statues taller than buildings. A Mesopotamian king carves victories into cliffs. But for the Harappans, nothing, no obvious royal tombs, no giant palaces dripping with luxury, no triumph inscriptions boasting about crushing enemies. It is almost unsettlingly modest, leaving historians with many questions. Who exactly was running this civilization? Somebody had to organize all this. Cities do not accidentally develop sophisticated sewage systems or standardized bricks. That requires planning, administration, and rules. Somewhere, somehow, someone had to sit through administrative meetings, even back in 2500 BCE. Imagine a Harappan official holding tiny clay tablets while discussing grain storage logistics for 4 straight hours. Humanity's bureaucratic nature truly never changes. Some believe the civilization was governed by merchant elites or urban councils. Others think priestly authorities coordinated social order through ritual. If there were rulers, they expressed authority differently, less dramatic, less obsessed with giant statues of themselves pointing heroically into the distance. The Harappans may have been one of history's few major civilizations, not entirely driven by rulers desperately craving attention. That feels strangely refreshing. Perhaps the royal palace hasn't been found. Archaeology is an endless process of saying, perhaps more digging will emotionally devastate our current theories. Harappan society was still hierarchical. Some houses were larger. Certain neighborhoods contained specialized crafts or wealthier residences. Inequality was certainly present. Humans invent social hierarchy quickly. Give us 15 minutes and a farming surplus, and somebody will decide they deserve nicer beads than everyone else. Still, compared to others, the Harappans were restrained. This calm restraint extends to their art. Their sculptures are usually small, quiet, and intimate. There are figurines of women wearing jewelry, tiny animals, and bulls with powerful necks. And then there are the seals, hundreds of them. Unicorn-like creatures appear often, likely stylized bulls. The animals feel symbolic, maybe religious or economic. Again, the Harappans refuse to explain themselves. One famous seal depicts a seated figure surrounded by animals. Some link it to early Hindu imagery, while others remain more cautious in interpretation. Religion certainly shaped life. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro suggests ritual water purification. But unlike Egypt, temples don't dominate the skyline. The Harappan spiritual world seems quieter, more woven into daily life. This subtlety contributes to why the civilization feels strangely modern to us. There is something familiar about cities organized around infrastructure and trade. You can imagine parents worrying about children or merchants stressing over shipments. Every civilization contains ordinary boredom alongside grandeur. Harappan food was varied: wheat, barley, peas, and dates. They kept cattle, sheep, and water buffalo. The zebu cattle, common in South Asia today, appear in Harappan imagery thousands of years ago. Picture them moving slowly through dusty streets. Ancient cities are sensory. Mohenjo-Daro would have smelled of smoke, wet earth, animals, and baked brick warming under the relentless sun. The Harappans valued cleanliness. Many homes connected to covered drainage systems. This level of urban sanitation was extraordinary for the ancient world. Human progress is not a straight line. They built thoughtful networks in 2500 BCE, while some later civilizations simply threw waste outside and hoped. Despite sophistication, health was still fragile. Skeletons show signs of disease and physical strain. Life expectancy was limited, and ancient life was exhausting. Civilization creates order, but does not eliminate hardship. Over time, environmental stress likely made those hardships worse as rivers shifted and systems weakened. Ordinary people feel consequences first. Food insecurity rises, trade disruptions increase prices, and floods damage homes. Ordinary workers absorb the earliest pain. Crowded cities also create ideal conditions for sickness. Unlike us, Harappans had no antibiotics or vaccines. They faced illness with whatever knowledge existed. Still, they endured for centuries. That longevity matters. Generation after generation, these cities functioned successfully, feeling like permanent fixtures of the world, which is perhaps why decline is so psychologically difficult. When you are born into stability, stability feels natural. Nobody expected their writing system to vanish. People simply lived. They were not ancient people to themselves. They were people with routines, ambitions, and awkward family conversations. The emotional architecture of humanity barely changes. Only the scenery does. And eventually, the scenery of the Indus world began changing beyond recovery. The great cities became quieter. Imagine the final generations who remembered the old civilization properly, telling stories about busier times. Every collapsing society contains people who remember when things worked better. That sadness echoes across history. After enough time, memory collapses too. The stories disappear, the names fade, until all that remains are silent streets beneath the dust, and thousands of future historians desperately trying to reconstruct an entire civilization from broken pottery and extremely impressive drains. The streets of Pompeii were never truly quiet, even before sunrise. Somewhere nearby, a mule was already complaining about its existence in the loudest possible way, iron shoes scraping against stone. Bakers had begun work hours ago because Romans still insisted on waking up at unreasonable times for fresh bread. The ovens glowed orange in the darkness, and the smell of baking loaves drifted through the narrow lanes. It was comforting, ordinary, familiar. Exactly the sort of morning nobody remembers, because nothing important is supposed to happen during it. Inside a modest house near the edge of town, Julia folded linens while trying not to think about the strange shaking. Cups rattled sometimes, lamps trembled slightly. A few weeks earlier, a crack had appeared in the wall near the courtyard fountain. Her husband promised to fix it eventually, which in Roman terms probably meant sometime before the collapse of civilization. The earthquakes had become part of life now. People complained about them the way modern people complain about traffic. Annoying, yes. Dangerous? Probably not. At least that's what everyone told themselves. Outside, the marketplace slowly came alive. Merchants arranged olives in neat piles that would not stay neat for long. Fishmongers shouted over one another while trying to convince customers their fish smelled only slightly less terrible than usual. Children darted through the crowd barefoot, weaving around carts and baskets with supernatural confidence. And above all of it, looming quietly in the distance, stood Mount Vesuvius. Not dramatic, not smoking heavily, just sitting there beneath the morning sky like it had for generations. Calm, silent. Imagine living beside a sleeping volcano so long that you completely forget the volcano part. Familiarity had dulled terror into background scenery. Around mid-morning, another tremor rolled beneath the city. Stronger this time. Walls creaked. Birds exploded into the air from rooftops. A statue toppled somewhere in the distance. People paused, looked around nervously. Then, because humans are committed to pretending everything is fine, most simply continued with their day. A man collecting water from a public fountain glanced toward the mountain and frowned. Something looked odd. There was a haze near the summit now, thin at first, easy to dismiss as cloud or mist, but it grew darker minute by minute. Still, daily life marched on. In a bathhouse near the Forum, wealthy citizens lounged in warm pools discussing politics. Attendants scraped oil from skin with curved metal tools, while men argued loudly about taxes and grain prices. Then came the sound. Not an explosion exactly, more like the sky itself tearing open. A deep, violent crack rolled across the city. Windows rattled violently. Dogs began barking all at once. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. In the baths, several men stood abruptly, water sloshing across the floor. The top of Vesuvius had split apart. A massive column of ash and stone blasted into the air, rising miles above the mountain in a dark tower. Black smoke twisted upward, while flashes of lightning flickered inside the cloud. It looked impossible, unnatural, and for one long moment, Pompeii simply stared. People froze in streets, clutching baskets, tools, children. Nobody knew yet that they were witnessing one of the deadliest volcanic eruptions in history. They only knew something was terribly, horribly wrong. At first, the ash fell lightly, soft little flecks drifting down from the sky like grey snow. Children reached out to catch it. Some people even laughed nervously, trying to convince themselves this was strange but survivable. Romans had no real understanding of volcanic eruptions. There was no emergency broadcast, no scientist on television explaining pyroclastic flow, just confusion spreading street by street, while the mountain continued tearing itself apart above them. Then the stones began to fall, not pebbles. Chunks of pumice rock, hot and jagged, raining from the sky hard enough to crack roof tiles and smash carts. The sound became relentless. Thousands upon thousands of impacts hammering the city from above. People screamed and covered their heads with cloaks, cushions, anything they could grab. The streets clogged almost immediately. Some families fled toward the gates carrying children and valuables. Others locked themselves indoors, believing thick walls would protect them. For many, that decision sealed their fate. Inside homes across Pompeii, panic finally replaced denial. Lamps flickered in rooms already growing dark beneath the thickening ash cloud. Mothers tied cloth over their children's mouths to help them breathe. Men struggled to drag heavy furniture against doors as debris battered the roofs overhead. Somewhere nearby, horses shrieked in terror from collapsing stables. Somewhere else, a priest shouted prayers no one could hear over the roar. And still Vesuvius kept rising higher into the sky. Hour after hour, ash buried the city deeper. Streets disappeared first, then wagons, then entire ground floors. People trying to escape found themselves wading through knee-deep volcanic debris while rocks crashed around them from above. The air became nearly impossible to breathe. Every inhale tasted like dust and sulfur. Torches barely pierced the darkness now. It was midday, but Pompeii looked like midnight. One Roman writer later described the cloud as so thick you could not see your hand in front of your face. Imagine that, a city erased not only physically, but visually. The world reduced to choking blackness and noise. Some citizens escaped early enough. A few fled by sea. Others ran across the countryside beneath falling ash. But thousands stayed too long, because they waited for family, because they gathered possessions, because humans always think there will be a little more time. There usually isn't. Near dawn the following morning, the mountain unleashed its deadliest weapon, the pyroclastic surge, a superheated avalanche of gas, ash, and shattered rock racing down the slopes faster than a horse could gallop, hot enough to kill instantly, powerful enough to flatten buildings. Pompeii never stood a chance. The cloud hit the city like the end of the world. People collapsed where they stood. Some curled around loved ones. Others died shielding their faces from heat that reached hundreds of degrees in seconds. The streets vanished beneath waves of ash. Roofs caved inward. Walls disappeared. Entire lives froze in place forever beneath volcanic debris. And then, silence. Not immediately. The eruption continued for hours more, but eventually even Vesuvius grew quiet again. The ash settled. The fires dimmed. The screams stopped. Pompeii was gone, buried beneath layers of volcanic ash so deep that over time the world forgot where the city had even been. Gardens disappeared. Temples vanished. Names faded. For nearly 17 centuries, the people of Pompeii remained hidden exactly where they fell on that terrible day. And when archaeologists finally uncovered the city centuries later, they found something haunting. Not grand heroes, not dramatic final battles, just ordinary people caught in an impossible moment. A dog still chained near a doorway, a loaf of bread hardened in an oven, a family huddled together in one final embrace. Tiny snapshots of daily life interrupted without warning. The kind of details that suddenly make history feel painfully real. Because Pompeii was never only about destruction. It was about how fragile normal life truly is. One morning you are buying bread, arguing about taxes, feeding animals, worrying about cracked walls and noisy neighbors. And the next, history remembers your city as a tragedy, frozen in ash forever. And strangely, that is why Pompeii still feels so alive. Not because of the volcano, but because beneath all that stone and ash, we recognize ourselves in them. Let's begin in a time when death was less of a precise science and more of a strong suggestion. Because for most of human history, figuring out whether someone was actually dead was surprisingly difficult. There were no heart monitors, no brain scans, not even a reliable understanding of what dead really meant beyond, not moving much and looking a bit pale. And as you might expect, this led to some deeply unfortunate situations. People were buried, while still alive, not often, thankfully, but often enough that it became a genuine cultural fear, the kind that kept people awake at night, or more accurately, made them hope they wouldn't wake up in a coffin later. Now, before we drift too far into the soil, let's picture the scene. You're lying still. Maybe you're ill. Maybe you fainted. Maybe you just had a very dramatic reaction to something minor. Your breathing is shallow. Your pulse is faint. The room is dim. Everyone around you is already emotionally exhausted. And someone says very confidently, "Yes, that's definitely death." Of course it is. Because what else could it be? Well, it could be a coma, or catalepsy, or a neurological condition no one in the room has ever heard of. But those options are far less convenient than simply declaring you deceased and moving on to the funeral arrangements. So, into the coffin you go. And this wasn't limited to peasants or forgotten villagers. Oh no. This fear crept into every level of society, including the wealthy, the educated, and the deeply dramatic. Let's gently float over to 18th and 19th century Europe, where the fear of premature burial became something of an obsession. People were terrified of it. Not mildly concerned. Not casually uneasy. Properly terrified. And when humans are terrified, they do what humans do best. They invent elaborate solutions. Enter the safety coffin. Now, this was not your average coffin. This was a coffin with features. Because if you were going to be buried alive, you might as well have options. Some safety coffins included a small tube that ran from the coffin to the surface. This allowed fresh air to reach the occupant, which is a thoughtful touch, assuming the person above ground remembered to check on you, or didn't accidentally kick dirt into the tube while chatting about the weather. Other designs featured bells. Yes, bells. A string would be tied to the buried person's hand. If they woke up underground, they could pull the string. The bell above would ring, someone would hear it, ideally. And then, hopefully, someone would dig them up before things became irreversible. It sounds clever, comforting even, until you remember that cemeteries are quiet places. Wind moves things, animals wander, strings tangle. And occasionally, a bell might ring for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with a desperate human being clawing at the inside of a coffin, which must have been reassuring for everyone involved. There were also coffins equipped with flags that could pop up, or little windows for checking in. Some even had feeding tubes, just in case the whole situation extended into a longer-term arrangement, because nothing says peace of mind like being buried with a snack plan. Now, you might be wondering how this became such a widespread fear, and the answer is fairly simple. Medicine, at the time, was not particularly reliable. Doctors did their best, of course, but their best often included things like checking if a mirror fogged when held under someone's nose. If it didn't, well, that was that. There were also more enthusiastic methods. Some physicians recommended placing hot needles under fingernails to test for a reaction. Others suggested pouring irritating substances into the mouth, which, in hindsight, feels like a strong hint that they weren't entirely sure what they were doing. And then there were diseases. Cholera, for example, could cause a person to appear almost lifeless. Their pulse would weaken, their breathing would become shallow, their skin would turn pale and cold. In other words, they looked exactly like someone who had died. Except they hadn't. Not yet. So during cholera outbreaks, when death was frequent and fear was high, burials sometimes happened very quickly, too quickly, because when an entire town is dealing with illness, panic, and limited resources, no one is particularly eager to wait around for absolute certainty. They want resolution, closure, a sense of control, and so, occasionally, they buried people who were simply very, very unwell. Let's drift gently to one of the more quietly unsettling aspects of this whole situation. The exhumations. Because every now and then, a coffin would be reopened, perhaps for relocation, perhaps due to suspicion, perhaps because someone heard a bell and thought, well, better check. And what they found was not always peaceful. Bodies would be discovered in positions that suggested movement. Scratches on the inside of the coffin lid, fingernails broken or worn down. Signs that at some point after burial, the occupant had been very much awake, very much aware, and very much not pleased with their circumstances. Now, it's important not to let the mind run too far with this. These cases were rare, disturbing, yes, but not common. Still, rare is not the same as impossible. And that tiny possibility was enough to haunt people, including some very notable figures. Take Hans Christian Andersen, the famous storyteller, a man who spent his life writing whimsical tales and quietly worrying that he might be buried alive. He was so concerned about it that he reportedly left notes by his bedside when he slept. Notes that said, quite simply, "I only appear to be dead." Which is both practical and deeply unsettling, because imagine being the person who finds that note. You walk into the room. You see a still body. You see a note that says, "I only appear to be dead." And now you have to make a decision. Do you trust the note? Or do you trust your eyes? Neither option feels particularly comfortable. Then there was Frédéric Chopin, the composer. He had a similar fear. In fact, He was so anxious about premature burial that he made a very specific request before his death. He asked that his heart be removed from his body after he died, just to be absolutely certain. And, to be fair, that would do it. It's a rather definitive confirmation. His wish was granted. By the way, his heart was preserved separately, which is both fascinating and slightly unsettling, depending on your tolerance for historical oddities. And he was not alone in this fear. Many wealthy individuals included instructions in their wills to prevent premature burial. Some requested that their bodies be left above ground for several days. Others asked for repeated checks. Some even specified particular tests that should be performed before burial, because if you have the means, you might as well invest in not being accidentally buried alive. It's a reasonable priority. Now, let's pause gently and consider the psychological side of this. Why was this fear so powerful? After all, there are many unpleasant ways to die, many uncertainties in life, but this one lingered. And part of it comes down to control. Being buried alive combines two very specific fears: the fear of death and the fear of being aware during it. It's not just that you die, it's that you wake up, in the dark, in a confined space, with no clear way out. It's the slow realization, the understanding, the quiet panic. And that's what made it so haunting. Not the event itself, which was rare, but the idea of it. The possibility that, at the very end, things might not be as final as they seemed. Now, over time, medicine improved. Doctors developed better ways to determine death. Stethoscopes became common. Understanding of the body increased. The line between life and death became clearer, which is helpful, because ambiguity is charming in poetry, but less so in burial practices. And yet, even today, the fear hasn't completely disappeared. It lingers in stories, in films, in quiet thoughts that surface at inconvenient times, because once an idea like that takes hold, it doesn't fully leave. It just settles, like everything else in this story, gently, quietly, and a little too close to the surface. And as we continue, we'll meet more people who lived with this fear, and a few who, unfortunately, experienced something very close to it. So let's ease forward into the next chapter of human uncertainty, where death, once again, wasn't quite as final as everyone hoped. Let's drift a little deeper into the 19th century, where the fear of premature burial didn't just linger quietly in the background. It practically redecorated society. This was the golden age of being extremely nervous about being declared dead too early. And people, as usual, responded with a mix of creativity, paranoia, and mild over-engineering. Now, we already met the safety coffin. But what's important to understand is that this wasn't just a quirky invention that a few eccentric inventors played with. No, this became a trend. Entire catalogues were printed showcasing different models of life-preserving coffins, each one promising peace of mind in the event of a slight diagnostic error. Some were quite elaborate. You could purchase a coffin with a built-in breathing tube, a signaling system, and a viewing window, so that your loved ones, or possibly a very confused cemetery worker, could check on you periodically, because nothing says eternal rest like scheduled inspections. One popular design included a small ladder inside the coffin. If you woke up and found yourself 6 feet underground, you could simply climb up, assuming someone had remembered to leave the hatch unlocked, which, to be fair, feels like a detail that could easily be overlooked. Did we secure the hatch? Yes. Wait, secure it how? Oh, and then there were the bells. Ah, yes. The bells became something of a symbol, so much so that the phrase "saved by the bell" is sometimes linked perhaps a bit loosely, to these systems. The idea was simple: a string attached to your hand leading to a bell above ground. If you woke up, you rang. Someone heard. Someone dug. Everyone felt very relieved about the whole situation. In theory. In practice, things were less reliable, because cemeteries are not exactly controlled environments. Wind happens, animals happen, soil shifts, strings loosen, and sometimes bells rang for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with a recently revived individual, which led to a rather awkward situation. Imagine being the cemetery watchman. You hear a bell ring softly in the distance. You pause. You think, is that a person, or is that just the wind doing something theatrical again? And now you have to decide whether to start digging. In the middle of the night, in a cemetery, because of a faint ringing sound. It's not the most appealing job description. Still, some cemeteries did employ night watchmen specifically for this purpose. Their role was to listen, just in case. Which sounds simple, until you remember that this means spending long, quiet hours surrounded by graves, waiting for any sign that one of them might object to the arrangement. A very calm job, very relaxing, no stress at all. Now, alongside all these inventions and precautions, there were also stories. Stories that spread through newspapers, letters, and conversations. Some were true. Some were exaggerated. Some were probably the result of very active imaginations paired with poor lighting, but they all had the same theme. Someone was buried, and then wasn't quite finished being alive. One frequently retold tale involves a woman who was declared dead after a sudden illness. Her funeral was held quickly, as was common at the time. But later, when her body was exhumed, accounts vary on why, she was found in a different position than she had been placed in. Her hands were not folded. Neatly, they were raised, as if she had tried to push the lid open. Now, whether every detail of this story is accurate is difficult to confirm. But that's not really the point. The point is that people believed it. And once a story like that enters the collective imagination, it tends to stay there, quietly reinforcing every existing fear. Then there's the case of the Manchester mummy, which sounds oddly exotic for something that happened in England. In the early 1800s, a young woman named Hannah Beswick had an intense fear of being buried alive, not a mild concern. An intense, very specific fear. So instead of allowing herself to be buried, she arranged for her body to be preserved after death. And preserved it was. Her body was embalmed and kept above ground. For decades, displayed, occasionally inspected, and generally treated as a long-term project rather than a concluded life. Because if there's even a small chance you might wake up, the logical solution is apparently to remain unburied indefinitely, which, to be fair, does solve the problem, in a very committed way. Now, let's gently shift to another layer of this whole situation. The medical community. Because while inventors were busy adding bells and tubes to coffins, doctors were slowly trying to improve the actual process of determining death. And they did make progress. They began to look for more reliable signs. The absence of a heartbeat over a longer period. Changes in the eyes. The onset of rigor mortis. Decomposition, although relying on decomposition as confirmation is not exactly a quick solution. Let's just wait a few days and see what happens is not the most comforting approach. Still, it was better than guessing, and over time, these methods reduced the chances of premature burial significantly. But during the transition period, when old habits met new knowledge, things were still uncertain. Let's float over to a slightly different kind of story. One that involves a funeral that didn't quite go as planned. In some accounts from the 19th century, there are reports of coffins being opened during funerals due to suspicious noises. A knock, a movement, something subtle but enough to make people pause. Now, sometimes this turned out to be nothing. Wood shifting, gas buildup, the natural, if slightly unsettling processes that occur after death. But occasionally, well, let's just say that not every corpse was entirely unresponsive, and that led to moments that were less dramatic than you might expect, and more quietly confusing. Because imagine that scene, a solemn gathering, people dressed in black, soft murmurs, a shared sense of closure, and then a movement, not a dramatic resurrection, not a sudden gasp, just a subtle shift. Enough to make someone say, "Did you see that?" And now the room changes, slowly, uneasily. No. One wants to be the first to suggest that perhaps the situation has been misjudged, because that would require reopening the coffin in front of everyone and admitting that the entire event might be slightly premature. It's not ideal. Still, these moments, rare as they were, contributed to the overall anxiety, because they suggested that death was not always as clear-cut as people wanted it to be, that there was a grey area, a space where someone could be neither fully alive nor fully dead, and that space was deeply uncomfortable. Now, as we continue, we'll move toward individuals who didn't just fear premature burial, but actively prepared for it in increasingly elaborate ways. Because when you combine wealth, anxiety, and a vivid imagination, you get solutions that are impressively thorough, sometimes even a little excessive, but always rooted in the same quiet concern. What if they're wrong? So let's settle in a bit deeper as we explore the people who refused to take that chance and made absolutely certain that one way or another they would not wake up in the dark. Let's ease into the final stretch of this quietly unsettling topic, where fear turns into planning, and planning turns into some very specific, very determined instructions. Because for certain people, especially the wealthy, the powerful, and the deeply anxious, simply hoping not to be buried alive was not enough. Hope is nice, hope is comforting, but hope does not, unfortunately, come with a guarantee. So they made arrangements, very detailed arrangements. Now, one of the more common precautions was delay. Instead of being buried quickly, some individuals requested that their bodies remain above ground for several days, not hours, days, just to be sure. Because if there was even the smallest chance of waking up, they wanted time on their side. Time, fresh air, and ideally, someone paying attention. In some cases, families would place the body in a well-lit room and check periodically for any signs of life, which sounds caring, until you imagine being the person assigned to that task, sitting quietly, watching, waiting for something, a breath, a twitch, a sign, and probably hoping quite strongly that nothing actually happens. Because if it does, that raises a whole new set of questions. Now, others took a more mechanical approach. Instead of relying on time, they relied on intervention. There were instructions written very clearly in wills that certain actions must be taken before burial, not optional, not if convenient, mandatory things, like opening a vein, applying intense heat to specific parts of the body, using sharp instruments to provoke a reaction. None of this sounds particularly relaxing, but the logic was simple. If the person was still alive, they would respond, and if they didn't, well, at least there would be no doubt. It's not the gentlest system, but it is decisive. Then there were those who went even further. People who essentially said, let's remove all ambiguity entirely. And this is where we meet individuals like George Washington. Yes, that George Washington. A man known for many things: leadership, restraint, a certain fondness for not smiling in portraits, and also, quietly, a concern about premature burial. Before his death, he gave a very specific instruction. He was not to be buried for at least 3 days. No exceptions, just in case. Because even someone at the founding of a nation thought, let's not rush this. And honestly, that might be one of the most relatable decisions in his entire biography. Then there were people who opted for something a bit more permanent: cremation. Now today, cremation is common, familiar, almost routine. But at the time, it was less widespread and in some places viewed with suspicion. Still, for those afraid of being buried alive, it had one very clear advantage. It removed all uncertainty completely. Because whatever else might be unclear, that outcome is not. Of course, choosing cremation as a solution to the fear of premature burial does introduce a slightly different concern, but we'll glide past that gently. No need to linger. Now, as medicine continued to improve, the fear began to fade. Slowly. Gradually. Doctors developed better tools, better knowledge, and more reliable ways to confirm death. The invention of the stethoscope helped. So did advances in understanding circulation and the nervous system. Eventually, death became less of a guess and more of a diagnosis, which is a reassuring shift. Because guessing works well for things like weather predictions or dinner plans, less so for final rites. And yet, even as the science improved, the cultural memory remained. Stories persisted. Books were written. Edgar Allan Poe, for example, leaned heavily into this fear, because of course he did. If there was a gloomy, unsettling concept available, Poe was already halfway through writing about it. His stories often featured characters trapped, buried or hovering in that uncomfortable space between life and death. And readers loved it, or at least they were fascinated by it, in a quiet, slightly uneasy way. Because even when we know something is unlikely, the idea can still linger, like a faint echo. Now, if we step back and look at the full picture, something interesting emerges. The fear of being buried alive was never really about burial, not entirely. It was about uncertainty, about the thin line between states we don't fully understand. Alive, dead, conscious, unconscious. Where exactly does one end and the other begin? For most of history, that line was blurry. And when something is blurry, the imagination tends to fill in the gaps, often with scenarios that are not particularly comforting. So people adapted, they invented, they delayed, they tested, they wrote instructions in careful handwriting, hoping someone would follow them exactly, all in an effort to control something that felt just slightly out of reach. And in doing so, they left behind a collection of practices, stories and inventions that are, in their own quiet way, deeply human, a little fearful, a little practical, and occasionally just a bit over the top. Now, today, the chances of being buried alive by mistake are extraordinarily low. Modern medicine is quite good at what it does. Not perfect, but very, very good. So this particular fear has mostly settled into the realm of history and storytelling and the occasional late-night thought that drifts in when everything is quiet. But for those who lived through that earlier time, it was real, a small persistent question at the edge of their lives. What if they're wrong? And so, as we let this topic gently come to rest, somewhere between history and imagination, it's worth appreciating just how far certainty has come, and how, for a long time, even something as final as death wasn't always entirely trusted, which is, in its own calm and slightly unsettling way, a very human thing to worry about. And now, with that thought softly settling into place, we can let the soil rest undisturbed, quiet, still, and this time, quite certain. Let's begin in a world where getting on the wrong side of the church wasn't just awkward, it was structurally inconvenient to your entire existence. Because excommunication, despite sounding like a strongly worded letter, was really more like being quietly removed from reality as people understood it. You weren't just out, you were out of the system, no sacraments, no confession, no communion, no proper Christian burial when things eventually wrapped up, which, for most people, was the long-term concern. And perhaps, worst of all, everyone knew this wasn't a private matter. There was no discreet email or sealed envelope. This was announced, publicly, calmly, with just enough ceremony to make it feel official, and just enough finality to make it uncomfortable. And once it happened, people around you had to adjust. Friends became distant, allies became cautious. Even your most loyal supporters started to wonder if staying close to you might be spiritually risky, because if the church had cut you off, who exactly were you now? Still a king? Still a noble? Still important? Technically, yes, but also not entirely. Let's ease into one of the more iconic examples, Harappan of France. A king who, like many kings, believed that rules were more like suggestions, especially when they interfered with his personal life. Philip was already married. This is an important detail, because despite being married, he met a woman named Bertrade de Montfort, and instead of handling this situation with restraint or diplomacy or even mild hesitation, he decided to marry her. Anyway, because why not double down? Now, there was one small issue. His first wife was still very much alive, and the church, somewhat predictably, did not approve of this arrangement at all. So Philip was excommunicated, just like that. Now, you might imagine this caused a moment of reflection, a pause, a reconsideration of life choices. But Philip, in a move that feels almost impressively consistent, chose to continue living with Bertrade, because if you've already committed to the situation, you might as well continue committing. Of course, being excommunicated as a king created complications. His authority weakened. His relationship with other rulers became strained, and there was always that quiet pressure from the church, gently insisting that perhaps he should fix things. Eventually, after years of this ongoing situation, Philip did reconcile with the church, which, in medieval terms, usually meant agreeing to separate from the person who caused the issue in the first place. Whether that separation was emotionally convincing is less clear, but officially things were resolved. Now let's float over to someone who handled excommunication with a bit more repetition. Meet Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor. A man so consistently at odds with the church that excommunication became less of a rare event and more of a recurring theme. Frederick was intelligent, charismatic, and, unfortunately for his relationship with the papacy, extremely independent-minded. He didn't like being told what to do, which is a charming quality in small doses. Less so when you're dealing with the Pope. Frederick was excommunicated multiple times. Not once, not twice, multiple. Because every time there was an agreement, he would, in some way, drift away from it. There were promises to go on crusade, delays, excuses, political maneuvering, and eventually the Church would respond with excommunication again. At a certain point it became almost routine. Oh, Frederick's been excommunicated again. Of course he has. And yet, despite this ongoing spiritual conflict, Frederick continued to rule, to negotiate, to influence events across Europe, which highlights something interesting. Excommunication was powerful, but it wasn't always absolute. For someone like Frederick, it was a problem, but not an ending. More like an ongoing inconvenience, a very official disagreement that never quite settled. Now, let's drift gently to England again, because England has a habit of producing rulers who don't quite get along with authority. This time, we meet Henry VIII, a man best known for his marriages. Plural, very plural. Henry began as a loyal Catholic king, defender of the faith, no less. But then came the issue of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He wanted an annulment. The Pope, after some consideration and a fair amount of political pressure from Catherine's powerful relatives, said no. And Henry, being Henry, did not take this as a final answer. He took it as the beginning of a new plan, which was to separate from the authority of the Pope entirely. Because if you can't get approval, you can always change the system. So Henry established the Church of England, with himself at the head, which solved his immediate problem, but also led to his excommunication. Because, from the Pope's perspective, this was not a minor disagreement. This was a full structural break. Now, Henry's response to excommunication was remarkably calm, because by that point, he had already built an alternative. He didn't need reconciliation. He had redefined the rules, which is one way to handle conflict, not necessarily the simplest, but certainly effective. Now, let's ease into a quieter, more introspective figure, Dante Alighieri, a poet, a writer, a man who spent a significant portion of his life in exile. Dante's excommunication came from political conflict in Florence, factions, alliances, shifting power dynamics, the usual complex arrangement of medieval city politics. He was accused, condemned, and eventually exiled. And along with that came excommunication, which meant he could not return home, could not fully participate in the religious life he had known. And so, he wrote about exile, about justice, about the afterlife. His famous work, The Divine Comedy, reflects this deeply. A journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven, structured, detailed, and at times quietly personal. Because when you've been officially cut off from your community, from your city, from your spiritual structure, you tend to think about those things a lot. Now, what ties all these stories together is not just the act of excommunication, it's the reaction. Some resisted, some negotiated, some adapted, some rewrote the rules entirely because being excommunicated didn't feel the same for everyone. For some, it was devastating. For others, it was inconvenient. And for a few, it was almost routine, but always in the background, there was that quiet understanding that this was more than a disagreement. It was a separation, a line drawn, a signal that something fundamental had shifted. So as we continue, we'll meet more figures who found themselves on the wrong side of that line, some reluctantly, some repeatedly, and some almost impressively, because when belief, power, and personality intersect, the results tend to be complicated and very, very human. So let's drift onward into more lives that for a time were gently but firmly set aside. let's settle back in and continue, because if there's one thing history does reliably, it's produce an endless supply of powerful people who do not enjoy being told no. And when those people meet an institution whose entire identity is built around saying no, actually, well, things tend to unfold in a slow, stubborn rhythm. So let's float gently back to the papacy and meet another familiar personality type. The ruler who assumes rules are flexible. Spoiler, they are not. At least, not when the Pope is involved. We'll begin with Robert the Pious, King of France, a man with a name that suggests deep devotion, quiet humility, and a strong sense of moral discipline. And for the most part, that was true. He was genuinely religious. He attended church regularly. He was, by medieval standards, quite sincere, which makes what happened next feel just slightly ironic. Robert married his cousin. Not unusual for royal families, of course. In fact, it was almost expected. Keeping things in the family was practically a strategy. Unfortunately, the church had rules about this sort of thing, and those rules said, Numbiso Robert was excommunicated. Now, this caused him actual distress. Unlike some rulers who brushed it off, Robert took it personally. He worried. He reflected. He felt the weight of being cut off from the church he genuinely cared about, which in a way makes his story a bit quieter than the others. Less defiance. More discomfort. At one point, it said that servants refused to eat food he had touched, fearing spiritual contamination, which feels like a slightly dramatic interpretation of the situation, but also very on-brand for the time. Eventually, Robert separated from his wife, at least officially, and was restored to good standing. Though, like many of these situations, the emotional reality was likely more complicated than the official version. Now, let's drift over to someone who handled things with significantly less internal conflict. Meet Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, which, much like many royal nicknames, should be taken with a gentle grain of salt. He was considered handsome, yes, but more importantly, he was extremely determined. And by determined, we mean he had a habit of pushing directly against authority until something gave. Usually not him. Philip had a disagreement with Pope Boniface VIII, and this was not a mild disagreement. This was a slow escalation of tension over taxation, authority, and control, because Philip wanted to tax the clergy. The Pope said no. Philip said yes. The Pope said absolutely not. And so, naturally, things escalated. Boniface issued a series of statements reinforcing papal authority. Philip responded by challenging that authority. At one point, Philip's agents even confronted the Pope directly, which is a bold move. Not necessarily a relaxing one, but certainly bold. Now, Boniface prepared to excommunicate Philip, which would have followed the usual pattern. But before that could fully unfold, events took a turn, and without drifting into anything too intense, let's just say the situation resolved itself in a way that left the papacy slightly shaken. Philip, meanwhile, continued ruling, because sometimes, if you push hard enough, the structure itself begins to shift. And in this case, it did. Now let's ease into a slightly different personality, who didn't argue loudly, didn't challenge openly, but still found himself on the wrong side of the church. Meet Martin Luther, not a king, not a noble, a monk, a theologian, a man who, quite calmly at first, raised some concerns, specifically about the sale of indulgences, which, to simplify gently, were a way for people to reduce time in purgatory, often involving money. Luther looked at this system and thought, "This seems questionable." So he wrote about it. He shared his thoughts, 95 of them to be precise. And initially, this was meant as a discussion, a debate, a quiet academic disagreement. But it didn't stay quiet, because ideas, once released, tend to travel, and Luther's ideas spread quickly. People read them, agreed with them, repeated them, and suddenly, what began as a critique became a movement. Now, the church responded, at first with requests for clarification, then with warnings, and eventually with excommunication. Luther was formally cut off, declared outside the church. And unlike many before him, he didn't seek reconciliation. He didn't stand in the snow. He didn't negotiate terms. He continued, because by that point, the disagreement had become something larger, a shift, a division that would reshape Europe in quiet, lasting ways. Now, let's gently return to a more personal story, one that feels less like a grand historical turning point and more like a slow, human unraveling. Meet Joanna of Castile, often called Joanna the Mad, which, as usual, says more about how others perceived her than about her actual experience. Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Powerful lineage. High expectations. She married Philip the Handsome, a man whose nickname suggests elegance, but whose behavior was less consistently admirable. Their marriage was complicated. There were rumors of infidelity, emotional strain, a deep, consuming attachment on Joanna's part. When Philip died, Joanna's grief was intense, persistent, and to those around her, increasingly concerning. Her behavior didn't align with expectations. She withdrew, she fixated, she struggled. Now, while Joanna herself wasn't dramatically excommunicated in the way others were, she existed in a space where her relationship with authority, both political and religious, became strained. She was sidelined, isolated, her autonomy reduced. And in that isolation, there's a quiet echo of what excommunication felt like. A removal, a distancing, a sense that you are no longer fully part of the world you once inhabited. Now, what's becoming clear as we drift through these lives is that excommunication wasn't just a single experience. It changed shape depending on the person. For some, it was a public humiliation. For others, a political obstacle. For a few, a deeply personal crisis. And occasionally, just another entry in a long list of ongoing disputes. But always, it carried weight. Even for those who resisted it. Even for those who seemed unaffected. Because to be told, officially and publicly, that you are outside the structure that defines your world, that lingers, quietly, persistently. So as we continue, we'll meet more figures who navigated that space, some with grace, some with stubbornness, and some with a kind of tired acceptance. Because history, as it turns out, is full of people who found themselves gently, but very clearly, on the outside. Let's settle into the final stretch of this long, gently uncomfortable experience, where excommunication becomes less about dramatic confrontations and more about what it actually felt like to live with it. Because after the announcements, after the arguments, after the letters sealed with careful authority, life continued, just slightly altered, quietly reduced. Let's begin with someone who treated excommunication less like a crisis and more like an ongoing inconvenience. Meet Elizabeth, I of England, a queen who had a remarkable ability to remain calm while everything around her shifted. Elizabeth was born into complication. Her father, Henry VIII, had already separated from the Catholic Church. So from the beginning, her position in relation to Rome was uncertain. When she became queen, she restored Protestantism in England, carefully, strategically, with just enough balance to keep things from collapsing entirely. But from the perspective of the Pope, this was not a neutral choice. It was a problem. And eventually, in 1570, Pope Pius V issued a papal bull excommunicating her, which on paper was a very serious declaration. It released her subjects from allegiance to her. It declared her rule illegitimate. It essentially said, "You are no longer recognized." Now this could have been catastrophic, but Elizabeth responded in a very Elizabethan way. She continued calmly, because by that point, England had already established its own religious structure. Her authority did not depend on papal approval. So while the excommunication existed, it didn't dismantle her rule. It simply hovered, a formal disagreement that never quite resolved. And Elizabeth, with her usual composure, carried on as if it were just another opinion, which, in her world, it almost was. Now, let's drift to someone who experienced excommunication in a much more personal, almost reflective way. Meet Galileo Galilei, a scientist, a thinker, a man who spent a great deal of time looking at the sky, and then explaining what he saw, which turned out to be more controversial than expected. Galileo supported the idea that the Earth moved around the Sun, a concept that today feels fairly unremarkable, but at the time it challenged established interpretations of Scripture. And the Church, understandably cautious about large shifts in understanding, responded, at first with warnings, then with closer scrutiny, and eventually with formal action. Galileo was tried, not in a dramatic theatrical sense, but in a slow, methodical process. He was asked to recant, to adjust his views, to align with accepted doctrine. And eventually, he did, quietly, carefully. He lived the rest of his life under house arrest. Not excommunicated in the most severe sense, but certainly distanced, restricted, observed. And yet, even in that quiet limitation, he continued thinking, writing, reflecting. Because being cut off from authority does not necessarily silence curiosity, it just redirects it. Now, let's gently move toward a figure who brings us back to the emotional core of all this. Mary, Queen of Scots. A life filled with complexity, alliances, betrayals, and a constant sense of being slightly out of place. Mary was Catholic, deeply so, and this placed her in direct contrast with Protestant England, ruled by Elizabeth. Her life became a series of negotiations between countries, between beliefs, between identities. And while excommunication wasn't the defining feature of her story, the tension between religious authority and political reality shaped everything around her. She lived in a world where belonging was never stable, where acceptance could shift, where being inside or outside was not always clear. And in that uncertainty, there's a familiar echo, because excommunication, at its heart, is about belonging, or the removal of it. Now, as we slowly come to rest, it's worth noticing something. Across all these lives, kings, queens, thinkers, rulers, excommunication rarely looked the same. For some, it was loud and public. For others, quiet and internal. Sometimes it changed everything. Sometimes, surprisingly little. But it always carried a certain weight, a sense that something fundamental had shifted, that a line had been drawn, and that crossing back over that line was possible, but never simple, because it required acknowledgement, adjustment, sometimes even humility, which, as history gently reminds us, is not always the easiest quality to access. Now, today, excommunication still exists, but it no longer holds the same sweeping power over daily life. It's more contained, more defined, less capable of reshaping entire societies. And yet, the idea behind it remains familiar. The idea of being excluded, of being told quietly but firmly that you no longer belong within a certain space. It's a very old feeling, and a very human one. So, as this story settles, we're left not with dramatic endings or sharp conclusions, but with something softer. A long series of lives, each navigating the same quiet question in different ways. What happens when the world you belong to decides you don't? And how do you continue after that? Some resisted, some adapted, some simply carried on, and in their own calm, complicated ways. They all found an answer, even if it wasn't the one they expected. And with that thought, gently lingering, we can let this story rest, not resolved, not entirely neat, but quietly complete, much like the lives it followed.